Imagine driving home after a long day at work. The road's empty, you're tired, and all you want is to get home. Suddenly, flashing lights appear in your rearview mirror. Your heart races as you pull over, unsure of what's about to unfold. For James Thompson, a 32-year-old black man from Atlanta, this routine traffic stop turned into a nightmare that would change his life forever. What happened next exposes a shocking reality many face daily. James Thompson, 32, just wants to get home. It's nearly midnight as he cruises down the empty Atlanta freeway, his tired eyes struggling to stay focused on the road ahead. The firm's big merger kept him at the office way longer than usual tonight. As he drives, James can't help but think about his plans for the weekend. He's promised his niece he'd take her to the zoo on Saturday. The thought of her excited face brings a small smile to his lips. Despite his exhaustion, the hum of the tires on asphalt is hypnotic. James blinks hard, trying to stay alert. He's only about 15 minutes from home now. Just a little further and he can collapse into bed. Suddenly, a flash of blue and red lights up his rearview mirror. James's heart jumps into his throat. He checks his speed. He's not speeding. What's going on? James eases his foot off the gas, guiding his car to the shoulder of the empty freeway. His mind races. Did he forget to use his turn signal? Is one of his taillights out? He can't think of anything he's done wrong. The police cruiser pulls up behind him, lights still flashing. James's palms are sweaty as he grips the steering wheel. He takes a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. It's probably just a routine stop, he tells himself. Nothing to worry about. But as he watches the officers approach in his side mirror, a knot forms in James's stomach. Something doesn't feel right. He's heard stories from friends about traffic stops gone wrong. He pushes those thoughts away. Stay calm, he thinks. Just cooperate and get it over with. James's finger hovers over the button to lower his window. He takes one more deep breath, then presses it. The window slides down, letting in the cool night air. James waits, his heart pounding, as the officers draw nearer. As the officers approach, James's instincts scream that something is terribly wrong. But what happens next will make his worst fears pale in comparison to the brutal reality he's about to face. Two officers reach James's car. The taller one, his nameplate reading, Stevens, leans down to the open window. License and registration, please, he says, his voice flat and cold. James nods, trying to keep his hand steady as he reaches for his wallet. Of course, officer. He fumbles with his license, nearly dropping it before handing it over along with his registration. Officer Stevens takes the documents, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinizes them. The silence stretches on, broken only by the sound of crickets and the occasional passing car. The second officer, Baker, shines his flashlight into James's car. The beam sweeps across the empty passenger seat, then the back, lingering on James's briefcase. Is there a problem, officers? James asks, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat feels dry, his heart pounding so hard he's sure they can hear it. The officers exchange a look, but neither answers James's question. Officer Stevens continues to examine the documents, flipping them back and forth as if searching for something. James's mind races. Did he forget to renew his registration? Is there a warrant out for someone with a similar name? He can't think of any reason why they'd be so suspicious. Officer Baker's flashlight beam suddenly hits James in the face, making him squint and turn away. Where are you coming from? Baker demands. Work, James replies, blinking spots from his vision. I'm an accountant. We had a late night at the office. Another silent exchange between the officers. James feels the tension building, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. Something is definitely not right here. Officer Stevens finally speaks again. Step out of the vehicle, sir. His tone leaves no room for argument. James hesitates, his hand gripping the steering wheel tightly. May I ask why, officer? Have I done something wrong? Neither officer responds to his question. Instead, Officer Baker's hand moves to rest on his holstered weapon. He said, "Step out of the vehicle. Now." James's mouth goes dry. This can't be happening. He's done nothing wrong. But with Baker's hand on his gun, James knows he has no choice. Slowly, he reaches for the door handle, his heart pounding in his ears. As he steps out into the cool night air, James has no idea that his life is about to change forever. The next few moments will plunge him into a nightmare he never could have imagined, all because of the color of his skin. Have you ever wondered how quickly a routine traffic stop can spiral out of control? For James, the next 60 seconds will shatter his world and expose a brutal reality many hoped no longer existed. Officer Stevens looks up from James's documents, his face twisted into a scowl. "This vehicle is reported stolen," he says, his voice dripping with accusation. James feels like he's been punched in the gut. "What? No, that's impossible," he stammers. "This is my car. I have proof. There must be some mistake." But Officer Baker isn't listening. "Get out of the vehicle now," he barks, his hand already reaching for James's arm. James hesitates, his mind racing. This can't be happening. He opens his mouth to explain again, but before he can get a word out, both officers lunge forward. They grab James roughly, yanking him from the car. He stumbles, nearly falling to the ground. "Wait!" James cries out. "Please, just let me show you the paperwork. This is all a misunderstanding." But his pleas fall on deaf ears. Officer Stevens's face contorts with rage. Without warning, his fist slams into James's stomach. The pain is instant and blinding. James doubles over, gasping for air. But the assault doesn't stop there. Suddenly, it's like a dam has broken. Both officers are on him, fists and feet flying. James tries to protect himself, arms raised to shield his face. But the blows keep coming. "Stop resisting!" Officer Baker yells, though James isn't fighting back at all. He's just trying to survive. James can taste blood in his mouth. His vision blurs as another punch lands. He can't believe this is happening. He wants to scream for help, but who would hear him on this empty stretch of highway? The beating seems to go on forever. James loses track of time, lost in a haze of pain and confusion. How did a simple drive home turn into this nightmare? Finally, mercifully, the punches slow. James lies on the ground, every inch of his body throbbing. He can hear the officers breathing heavily above him. "That'll teach you to steal cars," Officer Stevens spits out between breaths. James wants to protest again, to explain. But he's too afraid to speak. He just lies there, praying this ordeal will end soon. Little does James know, this is only the beginning of a long night that will test his spirit and expose the harsh realities of a system stacked against him. James thought the worst was over. He was wrong. The next few minutes will reveal the true depths of cruelty that some are capable of inflicting on their fellow human beings. The officer's fury seems to have no limit. They rain down punches and kicks on James as he lies helpless on the ground. He curls into a tight ball, trying desperately to protect his head and vital organs. The pain is overwhelming, each blow sending shockwaves through his body. "Please stop!" James cries out between gasps. "I haven't done anything wrong. This is all a mistake." But his pleas fall on deaf ears. The officers are lost in their own rage, deaf to his words and blind to his humanity. "Stop resisting!" Officer Stevens shouts, though James isn't fighting back at all. He's just trying to survive this onslaught. The accusation is absurd, but James realizes arguing will only make things worse. In a desperate attempt to end the assault, James forces his body to go completely limp. He hopes that if he stops moving entirely, the officers will realize he's not a threat. But his strategy backfires. The beating intensifies, as if his surrender has only enraged them further. Minutes pass like hours. James loses track of time, lost in a haze of pain and fear. His world shrinks to the space between blows, each moment of relief fleeting before the next strike lands. He can taste blood in his mouth and feel it trickling down his face. Finally, after what seems like an eternity, the beating stops. James lies there, barely conscious, every inch of his body throbbing. He hears the jingle of handcuffs and feels cold metal close around his wrists. The officers roughly drag him to his feet, ignoring his groans of pain. They half carry, half drag James to their patrol car. His legs can barely support him, and he stumbles with each step. When they reach the vehicle, the officers don't even bother to protect his head as they shove him into the back seat. James's forehead smacks against the door frame, adding one more injury to his battered body. As the car door slams shut, James realizes this nightmare is far from over. Through swollen eyes, he watches his own car grow smaller in the distance as the patrol car pulls away. He wonders if he'll ever see it, or his normal life, again. The night stretches ahead, full of uncertainty and fear. The flashing lights of the police station come into view. For most, it's a symbol of safety. But for James, it looms like a fortress of injustice. What happens behind those walls when no one is watching? As the patrol car pulls up, James can barely move. Every part of his body screams in pain. The officers roughly drag him out, not caring about his injuries. James stumbles, nearly falling face-first onto the pavement. Inside, the fluorescent lights are blinding. James squints, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The smell of disinfectant and sweat hits him like a wave. He hears the murmur of voices, the clang of metal doors. Name? A bored-looking officer at the desk asks. James Thompson, he manages to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer doesn't even look up. Charges? Resisting arrest and assault on an officer. One of the arresting officers replies. James's heart sinks. That's not true, he protests. I didn't do anything wrong. Please, just let me explain. Save it for the judge. The desk officer cuts him off. They take his fingerprints, his photo. James winces as the flash goes off, his eyes still sensitive from the beating. He tries again to tell his side of the story, but no one's listening. Next thing he knows, they're marching him down a long hallway. The sound of angry voices and rattling bars grows louder. James feels a chill run down his spine as they stop in front of a cell. The door clangs open. In you go, an officer says, shoving James inside. He stumbles, catching himself on the wall. The cell is crowded, and everyone turns to stare at the newcomer. James can feel their eyes on his battered face, his torn clothes. What happened to you, man? Someone asks. James just shakes his head. He can't bring himself to relive it all again. Time passes in a blur. James sits on the cold floor, his back against the wall. The pain in his body is a constant reminder of the nightmare he's living. He needs help. He needs to let someone know where he is. Excuse me, he calls out to a passing officer. Can I make a phone call? I need to contact my family or a lawyer. The officer barely glances his way. Not now. James tries again an hour later. And again after that. Each time, he's ignored or brushed off. The night stretches on, endless and hopeless. James wonders if anyone's even looking for him. Does anyone know what's happened? As the first light of dawn filters through the tiny window, James realizes just how much trouble he's in. He's alone, injured, and trapped in a system that seems determined to ignore his rights. But he can't give up. Somehow, he has to find a way to fight back. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, something unexpected happened. The quiet of the holding cell was suddenly shattered by a commotion outside. James perked up, straining to hear what was going on. A woman's voice, sharp and determined, cut through the noise. I demand to see James Thompson immediately, she called out. James's heart skipped a beat. Who could be looking for him? The voice belonged to Sarah Rodriguez, a local civil rights attorney known for taking on tough cases. She'd heard about James's arrest on her police scanner and rushed to the station. Sarah wasn't about to let another innocent person get lost in the system. "Ma'am, you can't just barge in here and demand to see a prisoner," the desk sergeant protested. Sarah wasn't having it. "I have every right to see my client," she fired back. "And if you continue to deny him legal representation, I'll have this entire department tied up in lawsuits before breakfast." The sergeant's face turned red. He clearly wasn't used to being challenged like this. "Now listen here, he started, but Sarah cut him off. "No, you listen," she said, her voice low and intense. "I know what happened to James Thompson tonight. I know about the beating, the false charges. And I'm not leaving until I see him. So what's it gonna be?" For a moment, there was silence. James held his breath, hardly daring to hope. Then, finally, the sergeant let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine," he growled. "You've got 10 minutes. As the cell door opened, James couldn't believe his eyes. Was this really happening? After hours of feeling alone and hopeless, someone was finally here to help him. Sarah strode in, her eyes widening as she took in James's battered appearance. "James," she said softly. "I'm Sarah Rodriguez. I'm here to help you." James felt tears welling up in his eyes. For the first time since this nightmare began, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, with Sarah's help, he could fight back against the injustice that had been done to him. As Sarah sat down next to him, ready to hear his story, James took a deep breath. The long night wasn't over yet, but at least now he wasn't facing it alone. The cell door opened with a clang, and Sarah Rodriguez stepped inside. Her eyes widened as she took in James's battered appearance. Bruises covered his face, and dried blood caked his split lip. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, barely suppressing a gasp. "Oh my God, James," she whispered. "What did they do to you?" Without hesitation, Sarah pulled out her phone and started snapping photos. "We're going to need evidence of this," she explained, her voice tight with anger. "Every bruise, every cut, it all tells the story of what happened tonight." James nodded, wincing at the movement. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice came out shaky and weak. I don't understand why this happened," he managed. "I was just driving home from work." Sarah sat down next to him, her eyes full of compassion. "Take your time," she said gently. "Start from the beginning." As James recounted the events of the night, Sarah listened intently, jotting down notes on a small pad. Her face grew grimmer with each detail. When James finished, she placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "James, I want you to know something," Sarah said firmly. "What happened to you was wrong. It was illegal, and it was a violation of your civil rights. But I promise you, we're going to fight this." She leaned in closer, her voice low and urgent. "Now, I need to explain some things. First, don't say another word to the police without me present. Anything you say can be twisted and used against you. Second, you have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney, that's me. Use those rights." James nodded, feeling a spark of hope for the first time since the nightmare began. Sarah continued, her eyes blazing with determination. "I'm going to do everything in my power to get you out of here as soon as possible. We'll file for an emergency hearing, challenge the arrest, and expose the misconduct. This isn't going to be easy, but I've handled cases like this before." She squeezed James's hand. "You're not alone in this anymore, James. We're going to fight, and we're going to win." As Sarah stood to leave, James felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. I thought no one would believe me." Sarah turned back, her expression fierce and protective. "I believe you, James. And soon, everyone else will too. Hold on to that hope. This isn't over, it's just beginning." With that, she knocked on the cell door, signaling the guard. As Sarah was led away, James leaned back against the cold wall. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to take a deep breath. The night wasn't over, but now he had an ally. Now, he had a chance. As Sarah left the station, a fire ignited within her. The wheels of justice were about to turn, but in a direction the police never expected. What would unfold in the next few hours would shake the foundations of the local law enforcement and ignite a media firestorm. Sarah wasted no time. Her first call was to James's family. "I've seen him," she told James's sister, her voice a mix of anger and determination. "He's been beaten badly, but he's alive. I'm doing everything I can to get him out." Next, she dialed her contact at the local news station. "I've got a story you need to hear," Sarah said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "An innocent man, brutally beaten by police. False charges. It's all happening right now." With the media alerted, Sarah turned her attention to the legal battle ahead. She pulled up to her office, the sky just beginning to lighten. Inside, she immediately started drafting emergency motions for James's release. "Your Honor," she typed furiously, "there is absolutely no probable cause for Mr. Thompson's arrest. The officer's actions were not only unjustified but a clear violation of my client's civil rights." Sarah attached the photos she'd taken of James's injuries. Each bruise, each cut told a story of police brutality that she knew would be hard to ignore. She included a transcript of James's account, highlighting the inconsistencies in the officer's reports. As the sun rose, Sarah was already on her way to the courthouse. She marched up to the clerk's desk, a stack of papers in hand. "I need an emergency hearing," she demanded. "Right now." The clerk looked startled. "But, the judge's docket is full," he stammered. Sarah leaned in close. "A man's freedom is at stake," she said, her voice low and intense. "Find a way." 20 minutes later, Sarah stood before Judge Harriet Collins. The courtroom was nearly empty, but Sarah could feel the weight of the moment. This was where the real fight began. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. "Last night, James Thompson was driving home from work when he was unlawfully stopped, brutally beaten, and falsely arrested. The evidence I presented clearly shows there was no justification for these actions." She held up the photos of James's injuries. "This is what protect and serve looked like last night," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm asking for Mr. Thompson's immediate release and for all charges to be dropped." The police department's lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting. But Sarah was ready. She countered every argument, her words sharp and precise. This wasn't just about James anymore. It was about every person who'd ever suffered at the hands of those meant to protect them. As the hearing stretched on, Sarah could feel the tide turning. The judge's expression grew more troubled with each piece of evidence. Outside the courtroom, reporters were gathering, hungry for details of the unfolding story. Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult. But as she made her final plea to the judge, she felt a surge of hope. Change was coming. And it was starting right here, right now. Sarah's fight for James was about to hit a whole new level. News of his arrest spread like wildfire through Atlanta. Within hours, local activists were organizing a protest outside the police station. People showed up with signs demanding justice and chanting, "Free James Thompson." Social media exploded with the hashtag #JusticeForJames. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, you couldn't scroll without seeing James's story. People were outraged, sharing their own experiences with police brutality and racial profiling. James's family stepped up to face the reporters camped outside their home. His sister, Tanya, spoke with tears in her eyes. "My brother is a good man. He's never been in trouble a day in his life. We just want him home safe." Then came the bombshell. Someone driving by had recorded part of James's beating on their phone. The shaky video hit YouTube and went viral instantly. You could clearly see the officers punching and kicking James as he lay on the ground, not fighting back at all. people were furious. Comments flooded in from all over the country. "This is disgusting. Those cops need to be fired. How many more innocent people have to suffer? I can't believe this is still happening in 2023. The police department tried to control the narrative. They released a statement saying they were aware of the incident and conducting an ongoing investigation. But their vague words only seemed to make people angrier. Pressure was building fast. City council members were getting flooded with calls. The mayor's office was scrambling to respond. Everyone wanted answers, and they wanted them now. Meanwhile, Sarah was working around the clock. She gave interviews to every news outlet that would listen, laying out the facts of James's case. "This isn't just about one man," she told a CNN reporter. "This is about a system that treats people differently based on the color of their skin. And it has to stop." As night fell again, the crowd outside the police station had swelled to over 1,000 people. They held candles and sang civil rights anthems. The message was clear: James Thompson wasn't alone anymore. An entire community was standing behind him, demanding justice. The question on everyone's mind now was, how would the authorities respond? Would they double down and defend the officers? Or would they finally admit that something had gone terribly wrong that night on the freeway? One thing was certain: this story was far from over. And the whole world was watching to see what would happen next. The viral video had shocked millions, but there was still one person whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's. In just moments, a judge would decide James's fate, and potentially change the course of history. Sarah Rodriguez strode into the courtroom, her face a mask of determination. She carried a thick folder of evidence, ready to fight for James's freedom. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, peered down from the bench. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice strong and clear. "What happened to James Thompson last night was not just a mistake. It was a brutal violation of his civil rights." She held up her phone, showing the judge the photos of James's battered face. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Then, Sarah played the viral video. The sound of fists hitting flesh filled the air. "As you can see, Your Honor, Mr. Thompson was not resisting. He was being assaulted by the very people sworn to protect him." The police department's lawyer jumped up, objecting. "Your Honor, the officers were responding to a report of a stolen vehicle. They followed standard procedure." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Standard procedure includes beating a man who's not fighting back." Sarah seized the moment. "Your Honor, this arrest was unlawful from the start. It was racially motivated, plain and simple. James Thompson's only crime was driving while black." The tension in the courtroom was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah pushed harder. "I'm asking for Mr. Thompson's immediate release and for all charges to be dismissed. Anything less would be a miscarriage of justice." The judge leaned back, considering. She looked at the photos again, then at the police lawyer. "Does the department have any explanation for the level of force used here?" The lawyer fumbled for words. "Well, Your Honor, in the heat of the moment, that's not good enough," the judge cut him off. She turned back to Sarah. "Ms. Rodriguez, I've seen enough. I'm granting your motion." A cheer went up from James's family in the back of the courtroom. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. But she knew this was just the beginning. The real fight for justice was still to come. The courtroom erupted in cheers as the judge announced her decision. "Mr. Thompson, you're free to go. All charges are dismissed." James could hardly believe it was real. He'd spent the night in a nightmare, and now suddenly it was over. Sarah rushed to James's side, wrapping him in a tight hug. "We did it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. James could only nod, overwhelmed by the moment. As they stepped out of the courtroom, James's family was waiting. His sister Tanya ran forward, tears streaming down her face. "James," she cried, throwing her arms around him. His parents weren't far behind, enveloping him in a group hug. "Let's get you out of here," Sarah said gently. She led the way through the courthouse, shielding James from the reporters clamoring for a statement. Outside, a sea of protesters greeted them. The crowd erupted in cheers as James appeared. "Justice for James," they chanted. James felt a lump in his throat, touched by the outpouring of support from strangers. Sarah held up her hands, asking for quiet. "James would like to say a few words," she announced. James stepped forward, his voice shaky but growing stronger. "Thank you all for being here. Your support means more than I can say. What happened to me, it shouldn't happen to anyone. But I'm not giving up. We're going to keep fighting for change." The crowd roared its approval. Sarah took the microphone next. "This isn't over," she declared. "We're filing a civil rights lawsuit. The officers responsible will be held accountable." As the cheers faded, James felt the exhaustion of the past 24 hours hitting him hard. Sarah noticed his drooping shoulders. "Time to get you home," she said quietly. James climbed into his family's car, sinking into the familiar seats. As they pulled away from the courthouse, he watched the protesters through the window. Their signs and chants faded into the distance. Finally, James let out a long breath. He was going home. The nightmare was over, at least for now. But as he closed his eyes, he knew the fight for justice was just beginning. James thought returning home meant the nightmare was over. But as he stepped through his front door, he felt like a stranger in his own life. The familiar surroundings seemed off somehow, distorted by the lens of trauma. That first night, James barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashing police lights and felt phantom punches. He'd jolt awake, heart racing, covered in sweat. This became a nightly routine. Going back to work was its own kind of challenge. James could feel his co-workers' eyes on him as he walked to his desk. Some avoided him entirely. Others approached with awkward sympathy. "Hey man, we saw what happened on the news," one coworker said. "That's messed up. You okay?" James just nodded and forced a smile. How could he explain that nothing felt okay anymore? After a week of sleepless nights and anxiety-filled days, James knew he needed help. He found a therapist who specialized in PTSD and trauma. In those sessions, James slowly began to process what had happened to him. "It's like the world suddenly became this dangerous place," James told his therapist. "I used to feel safe, you know. Now I'm always looking over my shoulder." The therapist nodded. "That's a common reaction to trauma. We'll work on rebuilding your sense of safety." As the weeks passed, James found himself drawn to local activism. He attended rallies and spoke at community meetings about police reform. It felt good to channel his pain into something positive. At one meeting, James met other victims of police brutality. Hearing their stories, he realized he wasn't alone. There was a whole community of people fighting for change. Still, James struggled with trust, especially around police. He'd tense up every time he saw a patrol car. His hands would shake when he had to interact with an officer, but James was determined not to let fear define him. He threw himself into learning about his rights and the law. He volunteered with organizations that provided Know Your Rights training to young people. "If I can help even one person avoid what happened to me," James told his sister, "then maybe some good can come from all this." It wasn't easy. There were still bad days, moments when the anger and fear threatened to overwhelm him. But slowly, step by step, James was reclaiming his life. He was turning his trauma into fuel for change. And in doing so, he was discovering a strength he never knew he had. James wasn't the only one fighting for change. Behind the scenes, a storm was brewing that would shake the police department to its core. What started as one man's nightmare was about to expose a pattern of abuse that couldn't be ignored. The Internal Affairs Division launched an investigation into Officers Stevens and Baker. They were placed on paid leave, but that was just the beginning. As word of James's case spread, more people started coming forward with their own stories. "I thought I was alone," said Maria Rodriguez, tears in her eyes. "But when I saw what happened to James, I knew I had to speak up." Maria described a similar encounter with Stevens and Baker 6 months earlier. She wasn't the only one. Within days, the department was flooded with complaints. It seemed like Stevens and Baker had a long history of using excessive force, especially against people of color. The police chief tried to downplay the situation, but the evidence was mounting. Meanwhile, the police union circled the wagons. They released a statement defending Stevens and Baker, claiming they had followed proper procedures. "Our officers put their lives on the line every day," the union president said. "They deserve our support, not a witch hunt." But the city council wasn't buying it. They called for an independent review of police practices. "We need to look at the big picture," Councilwoman Tanya Lee told reporters. "This isn't just about 2 officers. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked." The incident sparked a broader conversation about police reform. Community meetings were packed with angry residents demanding change. They wanted better training for officers, stricter accountability measures, and a complete overhaul of the complaint process. As the investigation unfolded, James watched from the sidelines. He felt a mix of emotions: anger at what had happened to him, hope that real change might be possible, and fear that the system would protect its own once again. "I never wanted to be the face of this movement," James told Sarah one evening. "But if my story can help make things better, then maybe it was all worth it." Sarah squeezed his hand. "It's not over yet," she said. "But we're making progress. People are finally starting to listen." The city held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would this be the moment that finally brought real change to the police department? Or would it be another false start in the long fight for justice? The city's breath-holding wouldn't last long. A bombshell was about to drop that would turn this local scandal into a national firestorm. Sarah had been quietly preparing a move that would force everyone to take notice. Sarah Rodriguez wasn't messing around. She marched into the federal courthouse and filed a massive civil rights lawsuit on James's behalf. This wasn't just about one bad night. Sarah was going after the whole system. The lawsuit hit hard. Excessive force. False arrest. Racial profiling. Sarah laid it all out in black and white. But here's the kicker: James wasn't alone anymore. As word spread, other victims started coming forward. Their stories were eerily similar to James's. Before long, Sarah had a dozen plaintiffs. The lawsuit grew into something bigger, a pattern and practice case against the entire police department. It was like pulling on a loose thread and watching a whole sweater unravel. The city was freaking out. You could practically see the smoke coming out of the mayor's ears. They tried to play hardball at first, but the pressure was mounting. Every day, more people joined protests outside City Hall. The nightly news couldn't get enough of the story. Behind closed doors, lawyers were battling it out. Sarah demanded to see the officers' personnel files. The city fought tooth and nail to keep them secret. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She knew those files held the key to proving this wasn't just a one-time thing. Then came the depositions. One by one, Sarah grilled the officers involved. And man, did some skeletons come tumbling out of the closet. It turns out Stevens and Baker had a long history of complaints against them. We're talking dozens of reports of excessive force, all swept under the rug. As the lawsuit dragged on, it started catching national attention. CNN, MSNBC, even the New York Times were covering it. James found himself doing interviews, telling his story over and over. It wasn't easy reliving that night, but he knew it was important. People across the country were watching now. This wasn't just about one city anymore. It was about a problem that touched every corner of America. And James? He was right at the center of it all, a reluctant symbol of a movement that was gaining steam by the day. The question on everyone's mind was, how would it all end? Would the city cave and settle? Or would this case go all the way to trial? exposing even more dark secrets along the way. One thing was for sure, nothing would ever be the same in this town again. While lawyers battled in courtrooms, an unexpected force was rising outside. Who would have thought that a single traffic stop could ignite a revolution? As we're about to see, James's ordeal was just the spark. The real fire was yet to come. Local activists didn't waste any time. They organized town halls all over the city, and people showed up in droves. Everyone had something to say about police reform. At one meeting, I counted over 300 people packed into a high school gym. The energy was electric. James started sharing his story at these gatherings. The first time he spoke, his voice shook. But with each retelling, he grew stronger. People listened, really listened. You could hear a pin drop when James described that night on the freeway. "I never wanted to be a symbol," James told the crowd. "But if my pain can lead to change, then I'll tell my story 1,000 times." His words hit home. Soon, people were pushing for a civilian oversight board. They wanted regular folks to have a say in how the police department operated. The idea gained traction fast. The police department felt the heat. They faced growing calls for better training, especially in de-escalation techniques. Some officers welcomed the idea. Others, not so much. Meanwhile, the city council chambers became a battleground. They debated for hours about reallocating police funding. Should money go to more officers? Or to community programs? The arguments got heated. "We need to rethink everything," one council member said. "From how we hire officers to how we hold them accountable." In the midst of all this, something unexpected happened. A few forward-thinking cops reached out to community leaders. They wanted to start building bridges. Soon, we saw joint barbecues, basketball games, and town halls where officers and residents actually talked to each other. James threw himself into the movement. He went from reluctant victim to vocal advocate. I watched him grow more confident with each passing day. He spoke at schools, joined marches, and even met with state lawmakers. The ripple effect spread beyond our city limits. Other communities started looking at their own police departments with fresh eyes. It was like James's story had woken people up all across the country. This wasn't just about changing laws or policies anymore. It was about changing hearts and minds. And let me tell you, change was in the air. You could feel it at every meeting, every rally, every conversation on the street. The road ahead was long, no doubt about it. But for the first time in a long time, people dared to hope. They dared to believe that real change was possible. And it all started with one man's courage to speak out. Remember those officers who started this whole nightmare? Well, their world was about to turn upside down. The police chief called a press conference, and what he said next left the room in stunned silence. The internal affairs investigation was finally complete. It turns out officers Stevens and Baker didn't just cross the line with James, they'd been trampling all over it for years. The chief stood at the podium, his face grim. "Our investigation found that both officers violated multiple department policies," he announced. "We're recommending immediate termination." You could hear a pin drop in that room. Reporters' jaws hit the floor. This kind of thing just didn't happen here. Usually, cops got a slap on the wrist, maybe some desk duty. But fired? That was unheard of. Of course, Stevens and Baker weren't going down without a fight. They appealed the decision faster than you can say, blue wall of silence. And wouldn't you know it, the police union jumped right in to back them up. They claimed the officers were being made scapegoats for a broken system. Now, here's where things got really interesting. The city decided to hold public hearings to review the officers' conduct. It was like nothing we'd ever seen before. Regular folks got to stand up and tell their stories about run-ins with these cops. One woman, tears in her eyes, described how Stevens had roughed up her teenage son for no reason. An older man talked about Baker pulling a gun on him during a routine traffic stop. Story after story, all painting a picture of two officers drunk on power. James was there too, of course. He stood tall as he recounted that terrible night on the freeway. "What happened to me wasn't just about two bad cops," he said. "It's about a system that let them get away with it for so long." As the hearings went on, you could feel the mood in the city shifting. People who'd always given cops the benefit of the doubt were starting to ask questions. Even some longtime police supporters were saying maybe it was time for a change. The final decision on Stevens and Baker's fate is coming up soon. Whatever happens, one thing's for sure, nothing will ever be the same in this town again. The blue wall of silence. It's starting to crack, and people are finally getting a peek at what's been hiding behind it all these years. While the city buzzed with talk of police reform, James was quietly undergoing a transformation of his own. He'd survived the unthinkable, but could he find a way to thrive? The answer would change not just his life, but the lives of countless others. James kept going to therapy, and slowly but surely, he was making progress. The nightmares didn't come as often now. He could walk down the street without flinching every time he saw a cop car. It wasn't easy, but James was determined to heal. One day, James had an idea. He started a support group for other victims of police violence. At first, only a handful of people showed up. But word spread, and soon the group was packed every week. They shared their stories, their fears, and their hopes for change. James didn't stop there. He started speaking at local schools about civil rights and activism. The kids loved him. They'd lean in close, hanging on his every word as he told them about that night on the freeway and everything that came after. "You have the power to make a difference," James would tell them. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." All this activism brought James closer to his family. They'd always been tight, but now they were unbreakable. His parents beamed with pride every time they saw him speak. His sister became his biggest cheerleader, always pushing him to do more. As the months went by, James started thinking about making a big change. He'd been an accountant for years, but now he was considering a career in civil rights work. The idea both excited and terrified him. "What if I'm not cut out for it?" he asked Sarah one day. She just smiled. "James, you're already doing the work. You might as well get paid for it." And you know what? James found his purpose in fighting for change. Every time he helped someone stand up to injustice, he felt a little stronger. A little more whole. Don't get me wrong, James still had bad days. Sometimes the weight of it all would come crashing down, and he'd wonder if anything would ever really change. But then he'd think about all the people he'd met, all the lives he'd touched, and hope would bloom again. Before long, people started calling James an inspiration. Can you believe it? The guy who once just wanted to get home from work had become a symbol of resilience and hope. And let me tell you, watching James's journey, it was enough to make anyone believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better after all. Remember when James wondered if anything would ever really change? Well, the answer was about to arrive in a way no one saw coming. The question wasn't if change would happen, but how far it would go. It all started with the city agreeing to a massive settlement in the civil rights lawsuit. We're talking big bucks here, folks. But more importantly, they committed to some serious policy changes. This wasn't just about writing a check, it was about rewriting the rules. First up, new training programs for police officers. No more, shoot first, ask questions later, mentality. They brought in experts to teach de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and how to handle mental health crises. It was like sending the entire force back to school, but the real game changer? A civilian oversight board with actual teeth. This wasn't some toothless tiger, these folks had the power to investigate complaints, recommend disciplinary action, and even influence department policies. For the first time, regular citizens had a real say in how their police force operated. The department also adopted much stricter use of force policies. No more vague guidelines open to interpretation. They laid out clear rules about when force could be used and how much was acceptable. And get this, officers who violated these policies faced serious consequences, including termination. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers on duty. No exceptions. And here's the kicker, if an officer's camera mysteriously malfunctioned during an incident, it was automatically grounds for an investigation. The city also pumped more money into community policing initiatives. Officers started attending neighborhood events, coaching youth sports teams, and holding regular town halls. The goal? Build trust and break down those barriers between cops and the communities they serve. James's case left a lasting impact on local law enforcement. His story became required reading at the police academy. Recruits watched video interviews with him, learning firsthand about the devastating effects of police misconduct. Of course, change didn't happen overnight. There were growing pains, resistance from old-school cops, and plenty of heated debates. But slowly, surely, things started to shift. Complaints against officers dropped. Community satisfaction surveys showed improving trust. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And James? He watched it all unfold with a mix of pride and cautious optimism. He knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. His nightmare had become a catalyst for real, lasting change. James's journey from victim to advocate is nothing short of incredible. He took a traumatic experience and turned it into a force for change. But let's be real, there's still a long way to go. Police-community relations remain tense in many places. Trust is a fragile thing, and it takes time to rebuild. So what can you do? Get involved in your community. Attend town halls. Join local organizations working for police reform. Use your voice and your vote to push for change. Remember, every small action adds up. James's story shows us the power of speaking out. He didn't let fear silence him, and neither should you. The path to real change isn't easy, but it's worth it. So let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep pushing for a better, fairer system. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about police reform, it's about building the kind of society we all want to live in.